Hello, and welcome to Middle East Focus, a weekly podcast on regional affairs and U.S. policy, produced by the Middle East Institute in Washington, D.C. I'm Alistair Taylor, MEI's editor-in-chief.
And I'm Matthew Czekaj, managing editor at MEI.
From the inauguration of a new administration in Washington to the 12-day war between Israel and Iran, 2025 has seen a number of major developments that have had a profound impact on the Middle East. As we approach the end of what has been a momentous year, we wanted to spend the last episode of 2025 exploring the events and trends that have shaped the region over the past 12 months, as well as looking ahead to the issues likely to drive the agenda in 2026. To help us make sense of things, we're lucky to be joined once again by MEI Senior Fellow Paul Salem. Paul previously served as the Institute's president and CEO, as well as vice president for international engagement. His research focuses on political change, democracy and governance, social and economic policy, as well as regional and international relations in the Middle East.
Our listeners can subscribe to Middle East Focus on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and other podcast providers. And please check out MEI's other podcasts, Rethinking Democracy, hosted by Ganul Toll, and Taking the Edge Off the Middle East with Brian Katulis.
Paul, welcome to the podcast, and thank you very much for joining us. It's great to have you back on Middle East Focus.
It's great to be back.
Paul, I think it's fair to say it's been a pretty momentous year. Looking back at 2025, what do you see as the key events in the Middle East?
One way to think about it is it's the third year of a momentous set of wars that have changed the Middle East. I would say 2024 was more momentous in a sense almost than 2025, particularly given the change of regime in Syria, which had been a regime that had been there for half a century, and the devastation of Hezbollah, which was Iran's main deterrent against Israel and so on. So I partly think of 2025 as a third year of the events that have been happening since October 7, 2023 and 2024. The highlights are lowlights, but in the sense that, major events of 2025, one is the, entry into power of the Trump administration, and we can talk more about that. Certainly a major event was the 12-day war against Iran. This came after, as we had mentioned, the devastation of Hezbollah in 2024. That decisively, I think, indicated a shift in the balance of power in the Middle East in favor of Israel or Israel and the U.S., and certainly Iran not only losing the impact of its sort of proxy forces around the region, not really being able to deter attacks on Iran, but Iran finding itself effectively defenseless against Israeli and American airstrikes. And we can talk certainly more about that. In 2025 as well, I would say that, the escalation and then de-escalation of the situation in Gaza with the Sharm el-Sheikh conference and the ceasefire in Gaza, something that is of great importance, certainly for the people of Gaza. It has not yet transitioned into a new order in Gaza, a new governance structure, anything like that, but it did limit or bring to an end the large-scale suffering that was happening. So that was significant. And in Syria and Lebanon, the first year of sort of new orders, new administration in Syria, obviously that came to power in December of last year. This was their first year, and we can talk about how they did. And the first year of a new president, prime minister, and government in Lebanon. Again, something we can talk about. I think also noteworthy is the elevation of U.S.-Saudi relations, U.S.-Gulf relations in general. That's a whole complicated set of issues, but I think was also confirmed at the end of the year with the national security strategy, talking even more about that relationship and how that important that has become. On the negative side, a deterioration or the situation in the Sudan and a deterioration or escalation of war in Yemen. Both came in the final quarter of 2025 and indicated a serious rift between Saudi Arabia and the UAE that we can certainly talk about. So those are some of the things that one saw in this year.
We'll delve into a number of those topics in more detail as we go on, but for now I want to keep things on the kind of macro level. What surprised you the most this year?
At the macro level, what was in a way surprising to me is, and I've written repeatedly about this, how the dramatic shift in the balance of power has not been translated into negotiations, political arrangements, a new order, a new status quo. Often, in decisive wars and decisive battles, and I would say Israel really has won, pretty much all the wars it got into over the last 2 years. But it and the region has not transitioned from, decisive wars to political arrangements, negotiations and political arrangements, as often happens at the end of decisive wars. That's something that I keep looking for, and I don't see it happening. Uh, Another thing that continues to surprise me is despite the great influence that Saudi Arabia and other Arab, countries, whether it's UAE or Qatar, clearly playing a very large role in the region and in some cases globally, but still how little agency the Arab states seem to have in determining the course of events in the region. You'd have to say the top four players in the Middle East, none of them are Arab countries. They're, Israel, Iran, maybe Turkey, and the US. The Arab countries are players, but they don't seem to be decisive players in a region that is in the majority an Arab region.
Paul, MEI just released a year-end roundup looking ahead to 2026, and that's available for our listeners on the MEI website, and there's also a link in the episode notes for this episode. You wrote a short regional overview for it, and I think just to your points just now, you entitled that piece "A Region in Suspended Resolution," and I think that really underscores exactly what you were just saying there, that we're still kind of waiting for that transition from these battlefield gains, especially by Israel, and what would come out of that? What would be the kind of tangible political outcomes of that?
Yeah, I mean, in that piece, I say the region is in need of two strategic rethinks, but I doubt that those strategic rethinks will take place. And the two places I indicate that require a strategic rethink are Iran and Israel. That in Israel, as I've been saying, Israel has won a series of major uh, armed conflicts in Gaza and Lebanon and Syria and Iran. And yet, the Israeli government, led by Prime Minister Netanyahu, does not seem able to transition from open-ended armed conflict, which we're still seeing in Gaza and Lebanon and Syria, and probably we're going to see again in Iran, into consolidating that superiority into negotiations and new orders. And as I write in the piece, the Israeli government has not put forward a strategic vision of how it imagines 7 million Jews are going to live alongside 7 million Palestinian Arabs. There's no plan other than the ongoing mess and conflict, which is Gaza, and the escalating conflict, which is the West Bank. That is not a strategic vision. It continues and it expanded its occupation in Syria and Lebanon. It created the conditions for tremendous and generally positive change in those two countries, but is not engaging with those new emerging states to figure out a sustainable and win-win solution on its northern border. And with Iran, also not a clear path forward. The U.S. wants to negotiate with Iran, but Israel doesn't seem to propose a political way forward. So I think Israel is still in an enraged crouch 2 years plus after October 7. It's traumatized, it's wounded, and led by a prime minister, a government, and an IDF, all of whom were responsible in not being prepared for October 7th, sort of the U.S. on September 11, and hence having a particular political, vulnerability to the trauma that's taking place. And the other, so I'm saying that Israel, needs a strategic rethink to find a stable, sustainable, secure, prosperous way forward for itself in the region with the Palestinians and in the region. Iran, similarly, has been in a contrarian pursuing a strategy different than Israel's at the time, but a strategy of forward defense, of building militias in other countries, all of which came crashing down in 2024 and 2025. And maybe unlike Israel, there's very deep discussion in Tehran, even within the regime itself. And the regime is a very large set of institutions and players. It's not a small organization. But you do see in Tehran very, very intense discussions about the strategic way forward. But however, no change of strategy yet, no major decision taken. But certainly Iran's strategy has been a lose-lose for Iran and for the entire region. It has not worked for Iran, certainly not for the region. And Iran needs a major strategic rethink that is a win-win for itself and its neighbors. That pathway is available for Iran as it is for Israel, but both of them don't appear anytime soon to be walking through that doorway.
Paul, I really liked how you structured your piece for our MEI roundup of the past year in the sense of these two strategic choices, one by Israel, one by Iran, and whether they can make them in the coming year. But I wanted to drill down a bit more on both of those. So on Israel, as you just laid out, the choice before it is, whether Israel can capitalize on, the battlefield gains that it has made, with some sort of sustainable regional diplomatic set of arrangements. So I guess the big question here is, how can Israel actually accomplish this? What does it need to do? What other choices does it need to make going forward?
I mean, when you pull back, really, in some ways it's simple that the Arab countries are already and officially ready for peace and normalization with Israel if a decent, I don't know what to call it, arrangement, because we really, talking about a two-state solution seems unrealistic, a one-state solution seems unrealistic. But it's also the fact that the main Arab states, and led by Saudi Arabia today, which want to go for peace with Israel and normalization, they cannot do that without a decent, proper, acceptable settlement for the Palestinian Arabs. What that settlement is, there's been decades of actions taken to make sure that a two-state solution is not possible. A one-state solution, we have a one-state reality, but a one-state solution is not acceptable to obviously the vast majority of Israeli Jews, at least. So, the simple version is if Israel or the Israeli Jewish majority could figure out how they want to live and coexist under decent terms for them and for the Palestinian Arabs, whatever that looks like, then the rest is easy. Because the Arab states and Israel's neighbors are have made clear they're eager for it. So that's the simple answer. But the hard reality is that even before October 7, but even obviously made more prominent by October 7, that Israel is not at all ready for that. So I think unless that is addressed in one way or another, I don't think the other fairly low-hanging fruit in the region can be accessed. I think all the more in an election year in Israel, it's virtually impossible. I never, discounted completely. It was, Menachem Begin who made peace with Egypt. That was unimaginable at the time. It was Sharon that withdrew from Gaza, maybe regretted it. But I don't discount the ability of the Israeli body politic to adapt, to evolve. But I don't see it happening in an election year, and I don't see it happening anytime soon. So I think the Israeli regional situation is going to continue to be in suspended resolution. And maybe the best we can hope for realistically in the short term is to, manage the damage, de-escalate in Gaza, make sure the West Bank doesn't unravel further, build on gains in Syria and Lebanon, avoid other major wars there, take the small fruit. But I think the obvious mega solution is still not within, I think, Israel's reach, let alone where the Palestinians sit. But the Israelis don't seem to be ready.
To the degree that this is a political obstacle, do you think what we need to see is a different government in Israel before that logjam can be broken?
Yes, would be the simple answer, but I don't think any of the rival candidates today, whether it's Lapid or Bennett, that given the mood in Israel after October 7, it's not like there's a peace leader in the wings or a peace movement, or any, whether we call it peace movement or something else. I would call it a hard pragmatic approach to how 7 million Jews are going to coexist with 7 million Arabs. Call it peace, call it being realistic. But I think where the Israeli mood is and the public is, I don't see a simple change of government this year as enabling such a change. I do think, Prime Minister Netanyahu, his positions are too hard-baked to make maybe a major pivot at this late stage, but also never count Netanyahu out. He's the survivor. And like I said, like Menachem Begin, the extreme right-wing, former terrorist, as he was called by the Brits, ended up, being the one making peace with Egypt and handing back the Sinai and all of that. Who would have thought that could have happened? So I don't count that out, but I think it's going to take a number of years.
One of the core issues here at the heart of this dilemma that I think you've been alluding to in various ways kind of goes back to one of the arguments that one of our colleagues, Natan Sachs, has made about this tension that we're seeing in between Israel's desire for regional stability, reintegration into the region on the one hand, but on the other hand, there's these hard lessons that it learned on October 7th, where it believes that it can no longer have any threats festering on Israeli borders. So I guess the question is, how does Israel square that circle? And beyond that, I mean, can Washington step in to help support that process in some way? I mean, what is the U.S. role here?
I wouldn't exactly say it's like how do you square the circle, although that's an interesting way to put it. But the threats that Israel faced and still faces, some are non-state actors and some are state actors. Obviously, the state actor is Iran itself, and Israel and the U.S. had 12-day war, and they're dealing with that. Israel militarily, the U.S. wants to deal with it also diplomatically, but that's a state you're dealing with, so that's different. And otherwise, you're talking about effectively the Palestinian territories, Lebanon, and Syria. And for a moment, I'm putting Yemen to the side because the Houthis, while they're an irritant and, certainly not great, but they don't, by Israel's own assessment, do not pose any major threat to Israel. But in the case of Lebanon and Syria, in the short term, Israel has certainly dealt a historic decisive blow to Hezbollah, contributed to the rapid collapse of the Assad regime, and brought about change in both Syria and Lebanon. And in the short term, in the tactical sense, and maybe call that the circle, that yes, they will go after adversaries, Hezbollah, other positions in Syria, because they don't want to tolerate the threat anymore. But if they were to think strategically, the antidote to armed state actors is rebuilt and effective states. And this is where Israeli and American policy diverges. American policy in Syria and Lebanon is to support the emerging states, the state capacities, and even though it will take time, to help those states take back control of their country from armed non-state actors. Lebanon has deployed the army in the south. The army needs more help. It's a phased program. Syria faces a lot of challenges as well. So, I mean, this squaring the circle is more what is tactics and what is strategy. Tactics is we'll just keep hitting at adversaries in a whack-a-mole approach. The strategy is maybe while doing that, engage with the emerging states in Syria and Lebanon and help them I don't mean help them directly, but engage with them and recognize that the emergence of those two states is the longer term solution to having to deal with armed state actors indefinitely. In the Palestinian territories, I mean, the problem is not new. I mean, October 7 was a very dramatic and horrific manifestation of the situation, but that too is the result of the absence, effectively, of a Palestinian state. That either it's 5 million people under siege or occupation that are going to rise up every once in a while and are going to favor armed groups or any way to resist the status quo, versus supporting the emergence of a Palestinian state, dealing with that Palestinian state, making agreements with that Palestinian state, having monitoring of that Palestinian state, and enable that state, like the Jordanian state, like the Egyptian state, like the Saudi state. It's a state-based order that Israel needs to live within. And that's where the contradiction between tactics and strategy, that's where I'm saying they're not pivoting from the short-term military battles to sustainable strategic political choices.
So let's very briefly turn to Iran now. As you've pointed out, the strategic dilemma they face in the coming year. Can they actually move away from this regional proxy model that they've had for extended deterrence against Israel? You've touched on many of these proxy members of the so-called axis of resistance already, but as a whole, I mean, where do you see the axis today? I mean, is it in hibernation? Is it reconstituting itself? I mean, what do we expect in the coming year?
Yeah, well, I would, in a sense, separate two issues. One is the profound strategic debate, I guess you'd call it, that's happening in Tehran as to 45 years after the revolution, if my math is correct, and at a time when, by almost all measures, Iran is in the worst condition it's been in, security-wise, economically, domestic politics, the water supply, and while it sees other countries around it, like Saudi Arabia and the UAE and Turkey, bounding forward into the 21st century, they're clearly not succeeding. And they've now rendered themselves completely vulnerable to Israeli and American attack. And that strategic rethink discussions are happening, but the way the Iranian political system is, which is effectively, headed by an octogenarian supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, and there's a lot of power centers underneath him. There's not a clear mechanism, unlike, let's say, in Israel, where you maybe have an election, then a prime minister, and then a government, and they make a decision. Here you have a rigid system led by an octogenarian who's probably not going to change his basic strategy this late in his life. So there's no easy way to predict how the Iranian political system is going to come out on the other end of the strategic debate. But I do think that things are set for change in Iran's strategic thinking because of the realities of where Iran is. Iran absolutely needs to negotiate with the U.S. There are parameters to that conversation. Iran needs to open up again economically in order to, revive growth and to calm tempers inside Iran. Iran has realized that Russia and China did not come to its aid, and hence its global, strategic thoughts ended up being not effective. So I do think change is coming to Iran, but hard to say when that will happen. Will any of it potentially happen this year? Will there be some kind of managed transition away from Khamenei to maybe bring in a younger figure and a new configuration in Iran? Given that the system does not accept that kind of change, like an election would do in other countries, that's hard to predict. Now, as relates to the axis of resistance, a couple things about that. First of all, the strategic value of the axis of resistance and like high strategic value is gone. The axis of resistance, particularly anchored by Hezbollah and backed by the Assad regime, that was designed to effectively deter Israel or the U.S. from attacking Iran directly. That was the number one function of Hezbollah. Uh, that has collapsed. It is not rebuildable as long as Syria is in hostile hands, from Iran's point of view, and Israel won't tolerate it anymore. So the high strategic value of the axis of resistance is already gone. Speaking with the Iranian interlocutors, they acknowledge that. However, the value, the overall value of having allies in Iraq and Yemen, lingering in Lebanon, and in Palestine or Palestinian territories, that is still valuable to Iran. They will, they're not going to give it up, or at least they're not going to give it up precipitously, or maybe for no price or no cost. But the value now is not of the high strategic value that it was before. So it plays a different function. And among those 4 or 5 arenas, I think they regard, Lebanon, Palestine, and Yemen as no longer that strategic for them because, they're not serving the functions they did. Whereas I think they're doubling down on Iraq because that is obviously their neighborhood, that's their neighbor. And I think hence there's a different approach to their presence and support for militias in Iraq. And I think that will only be solid and increase maybe in the months and years ahead, whereas their support in Lebanon and Yemen will continue, but not escalate or be redoubled in a major way.
Paul, the other major factor in the regional equation is, of course, the new administration here in Washington. As we approach the end of 2025, what are your takeaways from the first year of Trump's second term in office when it comes to the Middle East?
Well, one thing I'd say is I think Trump has the right idea for the Middle East, that he wants certainly the Gaza war to end. He wants the countries of the region to integrate. He wants Israel and Saudi Arabia to come to a peace agreement and normalize. He doesn't speak about a two-state solution himself. He doesn't take a position on it, but he's well aware that for that to happen, there needs to be a serious resolution for the Palestinian people. He's aware that that's simply a practical necessity. Vis-a-vis Iran, I think he equally has the right idea that a deal needs to be made. And I think his decision to, join Israel in attacking and escalating is part of how he negotiates. He escalates and then, wants to talk. And I think he's pushed Iran closer to needing to talk than it was before the 12-day war. And I think he has that right, that there needs to be a negotiated, tough solution with Iran. I like that he favors win-win solutions in the region, that he's highlighting new technologies, partnerships, economic integration, integrating the region globally, building supply chains, rather than focusing on, ideological obsessions or religious issues. He's focusing on win-win solutions on what, at the end of the day, the region needs, which is stability, negotiated resolutions, peace, and economic development so the people can get ahead. So I credit him for, wanting all those things and saying all those things and being, when he puts his shoulder to the wheel, he gets a lot done because he can get the Israeli prime minister to bend to his will when he really wants to. And he has very good relations with the key Arab countries and very good relations with Turkey. So I think he's extremely well placed, if he puts his mind to it, to get a lot of things done. So I credit him with that. Now, in his first term, he made major deals and breakthroughs in Saudi Arabia and the UAE on artificial intelligence and AI and chips and investment and so on, which, as I said, I think are generally good things. He finally leaned into forcing a ceasefire in Gaza. Maybe it was long overdue, but it was good that it happened. I think he needs now to follow through on what that means for the future, transitioning the question of governance in Gaza, something that the Netanyahu government is reluctant to do, getting an international stabilization force into Gaza, really transforming the Gaza Strip in ways that he, has talked about. Now, he sometimes talked about it in a kind of facetious ways, but he does know reconstruction. He does know what the region needs, as do many of the countries in the region, but he needs to put more effort in that process to make sure Gaza comes back to life. And then he needs to get serious with the Palestinians and the Israelis about finding a solution to this coexistence issue between Israelis and Palestinians, because then it makes the rest of the tasks easy in the region. Certainly with Saudi Arabia and the Arab countries, I think Saudi Arabia would sign, Syria would, Lebanon would, and then probably Indonesia, Malaysia. It would be a breakthrough moment. It would also have a great impact on Iran. If the Palestinians are satisfied with a resolution for them, that takes the whole Palestinian issue off the table for the Iranians and groups like Hezbollah and others. Will that happen? I doubt it, but Donald Trump wants to get the Nobel Prize before the end of his second term. That's the big one. Finding the resolution inside Israel-Palestine, then the rest becomes easy.
Paul, I also wanted to ask you about the new U.S. national security strategy. You touched on it earlier in the episode that was released earlier this month. The document lays out a pretty unapologetically, quote unquote, America First approach to U.S. foreign policy and represents a significant departure from previous U.S. policy in a number of areas. What were your thoughts on that when you read it, and how do you think it's being perceived in the region more broadly?
Well, a number of things. I mean, I think it didn't come, it wasn't that dramatic as it relates to the section on the Middle East. The most dramatic aspects, I think, of the national security strategy was its restating of the Monroe Doctrine, issues relating to the Americas and a potential war with Venezuela, dramatic, potential changes in Europe, in the approach with Russia, Ukraine, and European security, and potentially in the Far East vis-a-vis China and so on. And going from a sort of a multilateral global order approach to a transactional approach. When it comes to the Middle East, the national security strategy said a number of things which are not, dramatically shocking, I guess, in the Middle East. The strategy started off the section on the Middle East saying that for half a century, the U.S. prioritized the Middle East. We will no longer prioritize the Middle East. Well, that's exactly what Obama said. It's exactly. Obama wanted to pivot away from the Middle East. Biden wanted to pivot away from the Middle East. Trump wanted to pivot away from the Middle East. They've heard this before. The Middle East is happy not to be the primary priority of the U.S. It's okay with it. And I think the Middle Eastern leaders are also aware that, and certainly with Trump, his first visit outside the U.S., other than the Pope's funeral, was to Saudi Arabia and the Middle East. So I think they take that with a grain of salt, and that's not a big issue. Energy independence, which was a big part of the statement in the NSS, that's also not new. The fracking revolution and U.S. becoming an energy power has been, already years that this has been the case. And the energy producers in the Gulf have adjusted to it. Oil prices have been managed. They originally crashed, several years ago, but they are in a margin that is manageable for the producers of the region. And the energy producers in the region are well aware that even though the U.S. does not need Gulf energy directly, U.S., we can still call them allies in Europe, need this energy, and that the U.S. cares very much to maintain its military presence in the Gulf because its main adversary, China, gets its oil from the Gulf. So the U.S. ain't going to leave the Gulf for those reasons. So that energy issue is also not a major worry for the energy producers of the region. The other major point made in the document is that the Trump administration is going from a conception of great power competition with China and Russia and the Middle East to what they call great power jockeying. I guess a lesser version, a less conflictual version than what was used in the Biden administration, what was used in the first Trump administration. And I would say that's music to the ears of the leaders in the region, because they don't want to be in the middle of great power competition. They don't want to have to be put in a very hard place. They prefer the softer approach to U.S., China, Russian relations. That's better for them. The national security strategy, when talking about the Middle East, it highlights and starts with American alliances in the Gulf. It doesn't start with America's alliance with Israel. It starts with alliances in the Gulf and other Arab partners and Israel. And that certainly for Gulf leaders is, I think, a promotion. And they look at that favorably. And then the strategy talks a lot about nuclear energy, which is a nod to Saudi Arabia's nuclear program, civilian nuclear program that's partnering with the U.S. for the AI issue, which is partnered with Saudi Arabia and UAE, and supply chains which go through the Middle East as well as Israel and so on. And the national security strategy says that the U.S. will stop hectoring the Middle East, especially the Gulf, about their forms of government, about democracy, or about human rights, like Democratic and other previously Republican administrations used to do. Again, music to the ears of leaders in the region. And the U.S. strategy says the U.S. interests in the region, and these are long-term interests, include maintaining open supply routes for Gulf energy to global markets, keeping the Straits of Hormuz open, keeping the Red Sea open. So those are major U.S. and obviously the Suez Canal. So those major military commitments are unchanged and reassure the countries of the region. So really, for the Middle Eastern leaders, I don't think there's much here that worries them in the national security strategy. Maybe Israeli leaders are a bit worried that they're no longer front and center. They're there. There's a obvious commitment of the U.S. to Israel. All of that is in the document. But Israel used to be the primary central ally for all issues. That is no longer the case. There's a commitment to Israel's security. That's rock solid. But the U.S. now looks at Gulf countries and others as more integrated with broader U.S. interest in the Middle East.
Paul, we're running very short on time here, but before we wrap up, what are some of the key issues that you're going to be watching next year? What may be some of the most important challenges facing the United States or U.S. policy in the Middle East in 2026?
Well, I think I'll be watching, a lot of these dynamics that many of which we've touched upon. One, in a major way, the follow through and follow up on the situation in Gaza. That yes, it's good to have a flimsy ceasefire, but that's not enough. That the U.S. should lead a full transition in Gaza, should make sure that the West Bank does not sink into what we've been seeing over the past 2 years. That all of that links to, I would look for more U.S. seriousness and leadership about finding a solution or resolution of Israeli-Palestinian relations in 2025, at least get something started, maybe talks, maybe beginning of a process, and aim for conclusion before the end of Trump's term. So I will be looking for that. I'll certainly be watching the fortunes of, when Israel's going to hold elections, who will win, who will form a government, who will be prime minister, what will the new government's orientation be. So that whole Israeli-Palestinian, Israeli-Arab dynamic is critical. I will be certainly watching U.S.-Iranian relations. I would hope for serious negotiations. I think both sides want them and need them and have a lot to gain bilaterally. And I think the region has a lot to gain from a serious and strict American-Iranian negotiation that comes to a serious and strict agreement on key issues that certainly Iran has to stop doing, but then in exchange for major opening up for Iran. Maybe in a smaller bore, I would say I would look for further progress in Syria and Lebanon. Both countries need serious help from the region and from the international community. Both have made very promising starts in the last 12 months. And both are, if they succeed, are part of the resolution of at least calming down of much of the Middle East, which has been destabilized by both Syria and Hezbollah and Lebanon for a couple of decades at least. So, the benefit of stabilizing Syria and Lebanon goes well beyond just those two countries. Otherwise, I'd keep a worried eye on, Egypt, which still is the, the big elephant in the room, not really bounding forward economically. Population continues to grow dramatically. That is a long-term, serious potential crisis. And I'll end by saying the open-ended conflict in Sudan is not getting enough attention. The U.S. President Trump has paid attention to it. It's unfortunate that key Arab players, Saudi Arabia and the UAE, are on opposite sides. But that also means that if they can agree, they could, have a big role in bringing that war to an end. I would say the same about Yemen, that these are two kind of Arab wars that need to be brought to a conclusion, and not only for the desperate needs of the populations of those two countries, but for the instability and risk that they radiate throughout the region.
So, Paul, you live and work full-time in the Middle East. I don't know if this is entirely a fair question to ask you, but it is that time of year to do so. How optimistic or pessimistic are you about the coming new year?
Well, I'm not very optimistic about 2026. Going back to what we talked about in the beginning, while I think, take the change that happened in Saudi Arabia 5-6 years ago, which is a strategic, historic, reorientation of a major player like Saudi Arabia, if something like that could happen in Iran, if something like that could happen in Israel, then I think, in the long term, I'm optimistic because I think that those pivots towards more pragmatic, more open, more integrated solutions are they're in the cards, but when can politicians, political systems recognize them, and can they pivot towards them? Can they take advantage of them? Or will they remain stuck in what the whole region has suffered from for decades, if not centuries, if not millennia, which is historical narratives, religious identities, carried over traumas that keep getting reignited, and keep communities and nations stuck in reliving conflict and reliving trauma. I've seen it happen in other countries. I think it'll come, but maybe later rather than sooner. So I'm not terribly optimistic, although I have some optimism, but maybe not the bigger picture.
All right. Well, Paul, thank you. We'll just have to keep clinging on to those longer-term trends. That's all the time we have for this week. Thanks very much for joining us on the program today.
Thank you, Matt. Thank you, Alistair. And thanks for the team at MEI.
And thanks also goes out to our listeners for tuning in. And finally, a big thanks to our production team for all of their work on this week's episode.
To find MEI's latest coverage of pressing developments and deep-running trends shaping the Middle East, please visit our website at www.mei.edu.
You can also follow MEI on X, Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube, and subscribe to our email newsletters for the latest analysis and information about upcoming events. Just a quick programming note for our listeners. Middle East Focus will be off for the next few weeks for the holidays, but we'll be back in your feeds in the new year.
I'm Alistair Taylor.
And I'm Matthew Czekaj. Happy holidays to all of our listeners who are celebrating over the coming weeks, and we hope you'll tune in again in 2026.